And I'm going to present. So this is some of this information I've done to fulfill the doctoral studies, the requirements of the doctoral studies that I'm doing at Kane in conjunction with my research advisor, Dr. Namazi. And I will be presenting some of this at the Fall Voice Conference next weekend as well. So this is a nice opportunity for me to practice. So the objectives are to understand the social determinants of health that contribute to health and healthcare disparities in patients with voice disorders, to review the research on trauma, stress, and voice disorders, and to understand the principles of trauma-informed care. So I don't know how many of us are familiar with social determinants of health, but they are the demographic and socioeconomic factors that contribute to illness, healthcare utilization, adherence to treatment, and patient outcomes. More specifically, they're not really demographic, although some people still think of them that way. They're really the conditions in the environment where people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect health. So social, physical, and economic conditions. So the 5 categories of social determinants of health are education, access, and quality, healthcare access and quality, economic stability, neighborhood and built environments, and the social and community context. So to give you a couple of examples of what social determinants of health are, in the first domain, economic stability, that would be having employment. And of course, if we don't have employment in America, it's really hard to get a hold of insurance. So that's why that's a determinant of health. Also food insecurity. If you're food insecure, it's hard to maintain good health. Housing instability, income, job opportunities, and poverty. Within the education domain, early childhood development and education, where most of us work, right? Elementary and middle and high school, enrollment in higher education, high school graduation, language and literacy. These are all determinants of health. My work is focusing on early life stress, adverse childhood experiences specifically. And I'll go into that a little bit later on. Domain 3, healthcare access and quality, looks at, do you have access to health services? Is there primary care in your neighborhood? Is there specialty care in your neighborhood or close to where you live? Health literacy, if you're speaking another language and not fluent in English, if you don't have a high school diploma, are you able to understand the language around health that caregivers are presenting you? Domain 4 is neighborhoods and built environments, things like polluted air, contaminated water, extreme heat. Now we have wildfires to deal with. And of course, we know smoke affects the voice. And then the social and community context. And that includes things like discrimination and racism, where some of my work is at Kane is also focused on. So all of these social determinants of health, they impact your health outcomes. And they're also adverse or very stressful conditions that can contribute to trauma, depending on how you respond to it, depending on the severity of the situations, or how long you have to endure them over a period of time. These can all contribute to trauma and other health, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Social determinants of health also create health and healthcare disparities for vulnerable populations. So vulnerable populations would be, one second. Women, the largest vulnerable population. Women are really subject to violence, and they have more issues than men because we tend to have lower incomes. Racial and ethnic minorities are a vulnerable population, also because of income and the stressors that racial and ethnic minorities face around being a minority. Incarcerated populations, and we've heard a little bit of that now with COVID. Incarcerated populations experience COVID infections at a higher rate than the general population, because they're a vulnerable population. Also, sexual minorities and older people, all vulnerable populations to social determinants of health who can experience health and healthcare disparities. So health disparities are differences in the disease prevalence or disease outcome between two or more groups. And healthcare disparity are a specific type of health disparity where people have difficulty with access and use of healthcare. Both are influenced by social, economic, and political disadvantage that shape socioeconomic status. Both adversely affect socially disadvantaged groups and reinforce those social disadvantages as they're maintained. Both arise from discrimination, and both can be used as a metric of health equity or social justice in healthcare. So as disparities decrease, we're seeing more social justice in healthcare. As they're increasing, we're seeing more inequality, more inequity. So these are the health and healthcare disparities I've been looking at with my advisor in my program at Kane. We know that women are more likely to report voice problems than men. White people are more likely to report voice disorders than minorities, racial and ethnic minorities. Lower income individuals are more likely to report voice problems than higher income individuals. And those persons carrying public health insurance, such as Medicaid, are more likely to report voice problems than people who have private insurance. Women are less likely to receive a ENT referral when they seek help from a primary care physician. Racial ethnic minorities are less likely to report voice problems. They're also more likely to report delay in care than white people because of difficulties contacting healthcare offices, long wait times, lack of transportation, and cost. Those without health insurance are also more likely to report delay in care, and those who have lower incomes. So that's a big access issue. Some investigators report that there's a disparity in treatment adherence, meaning they have a harder time attending therapy when they're more likely to drop out, perhaps because it's hard to get an appointment or it's hard to get to the appointment. Other researchers do not report a disparity in treatment adherence. So that's an area where we're not sure of yet. So vocal health and healthcare disparities are definitely affecting us. So I said I was focusing on two particular social determinants, and they were discrimination and adverse childhood experiences. So my research is going to look specifically at discrimination. There has been no research done on discrimination in voice as of yet. But what we do know in general in terms of discrimination in health is that, well, let me tell you, just to get working definitions of discrimination, it's just unjust or prejudicial treatment on the basis of stigmatized status, such as race, ethnicity, sex, age, and social class or education. And then, of course, we have structural discrimination in terms of access to quality education, criminal justice policies, residential segregation, and there's individual discrimination, which includes microaggressions, disrespects, threats, or harassment based on individual characteristics such as race, gender, or age. So again, that goes after your vulnerable populations because you're looking at stigmatized social status. So when it comes to racism, racism has been linked to disparities in health outcomes for racial and ethnic minorities. African Americans experience anxiety, stress, and trauma symptoms as a result of racial discrimination and microaggressions. I don't know if it made as big of a ripple as it did for me, but the American Public Health Association did declare racism a public health crisis around the time of the George Floyd murder. Didn't really make a big ripple, I think, within our field, but that was there. Racism is definitely a public health crisis in this country. Sexism has been linked to reduced healthcare use and worse self-reported health for women, sexual minorities, older people, individuals with disabilities, are all vulnerable to discrimination because, again, they're vulnerable populations. And of course, where there's intersectionality, then the discrimination is experienced differently than if there is just one stigmatized area. And we know there's lots of research on adverse childhood experiences, and this is really big in our field right now, especially if you work in education. Adverse childhood experiences are just potentially traumatic events that occur during childhood. So experiencing violence, abuse, neglect, witnessing violence in the home or community, having a family member attempt or die by suicide, substance use problems in the house, mental health problems in the house, instability due to parental separation or incarceration in the house. These are all examples of adverse childhood experiences. So what we know is that most people will experience adverse childhood experiences. Most people will experience more than one, and then a smaller percentage of people report 4 or more. And the people who report 4 or more are, again, those vulnerable populations: women, racial ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, and lower income people. And that idea of 4 or more adverse experiences is really important to key in on, because people who experience 4 or more are more likely to experience the health problems in adulthood. So the health problems can include chronic health conditions like coronary heart disease, stroke, and health-related disability as a result of stroke, asthma, COPD, cancer, kidney disease, diabetes, obesity. Adverse childhood experiences are definitely social determinants of health. And the more that you have, the more potentially stressful and traumatic and the worse the health outcomes, unless you have protective factors, which we'll talk about in a second. So there was 2 ideas proposed as to why adverse experiences, stress and trauma lead to adult morbidity. Theory 1 is the idea of you need to take your own personal responsibility, right? And this disease is caused by delayed consequences of various maladaptive coping strategies such as smoking, overeating, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, high-risk sexual behavior, which people use to feel better because they are having a hard time dealing with the emotional fallout of their adverse experiences. But if you take a look at our pyramid here, you'll see that adoption of health risk behavior is pretty high up in terms of causes of the health issues, because underneath that you have all of these things that came before the adoption of the health risk behaviors. You had like a historical trauma, generational embodiment, poor social conditions, the adverse experiences, the disrupted neural development, which I'll speak about in a second, cognitive impairment, and then people dealing with their issues with the poor health risk behaviors. So we can't look at that as a cause. We have to look at the things that came earlier. So theory number 2 says, allostatic load theory proposes that toxic stress causes changes in multiple physiological systems in the body and results in damage to the metabolic, cardiovascular, immune, and nervous systems by a prolonged or abnormal stress response. And when we're talking about the stress response, we're talking about flight or fight, how that affects the body, your heart's racing and pumping to gear you up. You're taking in more oxygen, your body's on high alert and making these adaptations. When you have a positive stressor, like the first day of school, this happens normally and then everything returns to balance. When you have a tolerable stressor with protective factors, so a tolerable stressor might be there's a death in the family, or the family's going through a nasty divorce or separation. If there's protective factors in place, like social support, the body is able to handle it and things go back to normal. But when there's tolerable stress without protective factors, and when there's toxic stress, that prolonged and chronic stress from ongoing adverse experiences piling up one after another over time, the body cannot handle the wear and tear of the body gearing up in fight and flight. And there's a prolonged or abnormal stress response. Inflammation adds wear and tear to the body, and creating pathophysiology. So look at what happens. Children exposed to toxic stress without protective factors are at risk for permanent neurological changes to brain architecture, including changes in brain regions associated with stress, emotion processing, and emotional regulation, so that by the time they're getting to adulthood, they're adopting those maladaptive coping strategies. There's inhibitory control, which is why so many of our kids in school are being called ADD, trauma, difficulty with inhibition because of the wear and tear on the brain. There's memory processing and learning issues, decision-making and reward processing. And there's epigenetic changes that affect stress responsiveness later in life and in subsequent generations. There's heightened emotional sensitivity and reactivity to adverse experiences. There's decreased ability to cope. There's cognitive impairment, and there's heightened attention towards perceived threats. So this picture was actually in the New York Post a couple of years ago, and it just showed a normal 3-year-old brain and then a 3-year-old brain on trauma. And you'll see that there is what they call there's poor neurogenesis. They're not generating the brain cells. There's brain atrophy in some areas and enlargement of other areas. So the brain looks completely different because it's not growing up in healthy conditions. So we definitely know that adverse conditions, stress, and trauma is a determinant of health. It definitely affects African Americans and ethnic minorities, other ethnic minorities. We know that because of COVID, many Black Americans and Hispanics were dying and getting sicker at higher rates than white Americans or wealthy Americans. And it's because of these conditions, these social conditions. So my research is looking at how people with voice disorders tend to have higher incidences of trauma in their backgrounds, in their social history. We know that stress affects the voice. One researcher found that participants in a population sample who reported more vocal symptoms also had higher levels of salivary cortisol, which is a biomarker of stress. There's an association between stress and increased muscle tension in the neck and shoulders. We know that about a quarter of those seeking care for dysphonia or voice disorders show higher than normal levels of stress. There's higher perceived stress scores found in women than in men. And we know that studies investigating the effects of stress on the voice have had mixed results. But the most commonly observed acoustic effect was increased fundamental frequency. So the two are related. Oh, my message that I'm hoping to deliver into the world is to kind of push for trauma-informed care and hope that as a field, we get better at realizing the prevalence of trauma, that we recognize how trauma affects all individuals involved within a program, organization, or system, including a workforce. You know, SLPs are under a lot of stress. We work in situations where we can experience secondary trauma because of the things that our students, patients, and clients go through. And I hope that as a field, we got better at responding to the patients, students, and clients by putting this knowledge into practice. And one of the big takeaways that I'm getting from the research is that when we implement trauma-informed care, we not only help outcomes of the people that we work with, we also help increase health equity, because vulnerable populations, your minorities, your racial, ethnic minorities, women, sexual minorities are overrepresented among those who experience those social determinants of health. So trauma-informed care can help increase health equity for those vulnerable populations. So that's kind of it. I kind of blew through that because you guys are very quiet. But I would love to hear your thoughts and what you feel about. Actually, I did want to talk about another takeaway that I kind of skipped over. A lot of times SLPs have a hard time with working with people who might have histories of trauma, and we might think, oh, that's a counselor's job. But there are definitely things that we can do as clinicians to kind of help improve outcomes for our students, patients, and clients by encouraging those protective factors that I was speaking about earlier. So protective factors help kind of buffer against adversity and stressful experiences. So protective factors would be things like high quality relationships. So anytime we can help people to get social support, we're giving them a protective factor. Encouraging gratitude, positive affect. It's hard to have that when you're going through, adversity. But it is a protective factor. So whenever we can encourage people to kind of be grateful for what is going right, we're helping them to protect and not have the really harsh consequences of trauma and adversity. Emotional regulation, things that we work on with our students, cognitive flexibility, cognitive reappraisal. That's like changing a negative thought into a positive thought, looking at it a different way. All things that we can work on. We can encourage people, mostly our adult clients, towards using positive religious coping, like expressing forgiveness, as opposed to negative religious coping, like feeling abandoned by God or having anger towards God. Having a realistic, having people have a realistic sense of control over the traumatic situation. Encouraging healthful diets and exercise. Cultivating the relaxation response with yoga, meditation, mindful awareness, deep breathing, muscle relaxation. All of those things can help people to be kind of buffered against the effects of trauma.